Tom and Dane. We're talking about bugs today. And before we start talking about bugs, I want to know what your favorite bugs are. Tom, you want to go first?
Yeah. So I picked 3 out of the.
He was not prompted at all for this question.
There's 3 of them. Well, fireflies for one thing.
One. Yeah.
And I had read somewhere that fireflies they'll feed on the slugs.
Oh.
It's not so much the firefly itself; it's the firefly larvae. So, and I always thought fireflies are neat, you know.
Yeah. You know. I've always called them lightning bugs.
Well, that's a lame term. not lame. That's another term for it. Not lame term. That's not what I meant. Another version of it, I guess. Lightning bug, firefly, yeah. So,
exactly.
So that was one bug that I always, if you see a lot of fireflies, you hope that you have a lot of larvae feeding on
they're
slugs.
local in your field somewhere.
Yeah, and millipedes, like I said, that millipedes, they help break down the residue. And that's what, I think that's, so I like millipedes too. I don't really like them crawling around on the house floor and that, but,
Stay in the field.
Yeah. Do your job.
And ground beetles, because they feed on the slugs.
Those are 3 great bugs.
Yeah.
I'm still thinking over here.
And honestly, it takes an army of bugs, or it takes an army to do what you want it to do. You can't. One bug can't do it alone. So that's kind of how I look at it. You need a combination of all of them.
Well, I think you just made Dane's day.
Yeah, that's a great answer. I like that. Yeah, and you make a really good point too. It's like it's not just a single species. It's really this idea of a community kind of working together.
Welcome to Field Notes. Today we're talking all about bugs, but we're also focusing on seed treatments. Talking with Tom Ripp here and Dane Elmquist. And the way that seed treatments have an effect on larger entomological, aka bug world, on farms. And Dane is a conservation cropping system specialist. Is that right? All right, long title. With UW-Madison Extension. And Tom is Tom Ripp, a grain farmer just outside of Black Earth, and really just right on the edge of Black Earth. Dane and Tom, good to have you all on today. Can you take a minute, and we'll start with Tom, and introduce yourself and your farm / what you do around here.
Hey, Will. So, yeah, Tom Ripp, cash grain, corn, beans, wheat, and, just been conservation farming for a long time. My dad, he started some no-till practices probably 40 years ago, and I'm just carrying on that, and I guess we got more involved in cover crops and so forth like that, and we just realized that was the route to go.
How many acres do you farm, Tom?
It's about 360.
Okay. Nice. And corn, soy, and wheat, right?
Yep, corn, soy, and wheat. Yep.
Is it split third, or is it a little bit
No,
less wheat?
I usually plant about 30 to 40 acres of wheat.
Okay.
And that gets kind of rotated around.
Mm-hmm.
Some fields don't ever see the wheat because it's lower. If the field is not well drained, I guess we'll put, say
totally.
You don't want to put wheat in there.
Right.
So
sitting in that early spring water.
Yeah. So the fields that are getting the wheat, they're constantly in rotation. Mm-hmm. So there's always a cover crop, whether say if it's corn,
right.
Then after that it's getting a rye for a cover crop. Then the next season it's getting soybeans.
Right.
After the beans, then the wheat's going in there.
Yeah.
After the wheat's off, then a multi-species cover crop's going on there. So that field is never sitting idle.
Right. Great. Awesome. Dane, who are you?
I am a conservation cropping outreach specialist for UW-Madison Extension. I've got a background in entomology, so I'm very interested in, really thinking about how these conservation cropping systems affect the insect pests and the beneficials on farms that are using these practices. And a lot of the practices like Tom described, cover cropping, extending rotations by adding a small grain, and no-till have really significant impacts on insect communities, but we tend to not know as much about those impacts, and so I think it's a really critical piece of the puzzle to be exploring and thinking about, especially as we're approaching these, conservation practices from a really, wide lens, a system-wide perspective. So, I guess I bring in the bug angle to that story.
And a specific type of bug is what you focus on, right?
Yeah, I mean, we like to... Yeah. The soil arthropods are kind of the main.
Exactly. I didn't feed them at all.
That I like to concentrate on, because again, like a lot of the growers, like Tom mentioned, are implementing these practices for soil health, right? And then soil biology is one of these pillars of soil health, along with the chemical and physical properties. And so these soil arthropods are just a big piece of the picture when we're thinking about biology. It's not just earthworms and microbes, and so. Another critical piece of the puzzle to be thinking about when using these conservation systems.
Totally. Great. And so, Tom, you've been doing these soil health conservation practices for a while. Your dad was doing them as well, started them at least. And so I'm curious what you've seen as you've integrated more of them or on more of your acres. How have they influenced bug populations that you've seen through your personal experience, both pests and beneficials?
Well, I don't think I really noticed any noticeable activity, I guess we'll say, until I started using cover crops. I mean, when you no-tilling, you don't really think about it. It's just like, well, okay, there's crop residue, you're no-tilling into it, and you just kind of go with it. But once you start seeing, maybe it's because I just wasn't really focused on it, say 20 years ago, but then as time went on, it's like, oh, you start paying attention to it. You read more and you hear more, and it's like, I'm going to start looking at that. And then once you start, like with the cover crop rotations, that's where you start noticing things really start coming to life.
What specifically did you start seeing more of?
I think it's just the condition of the soil.
Yeah.
That was a big thing. It's like, it's just how mellow it was to plant into.
Yeah.
And it just, the soil was in better condition. And, that's the first thing I noticed. It's like, well, why would you plow a field when you got this kind of soil on top? The conditions were right. But then you start noticing other things like the residue disappearing, and it's like, well, it's, after a while, you pay attention to the earthworms, and you look at the earthworm holes and how far in the ground they're going and stuff like that, and it's just so many different things you really start paying attention to.
Right.
And it's just kind of neat, but if you're just truly no-tilling and your corn bean rotation, I don't know if you would really see that activity in the soil like that. I think there would, they always said cover crops makes a difference. In rotations, that's where the wheat comes in there. You get that rotation. And you get the cover crops in there. I think it helps to have something always living in that soil.
Totally.
You're feeding your organisms in the soil. And if you don't, well then, even if you're no-tilling, it's still basically dormant land.
Right.
For a while.
Not much for them to feed on.
Right. Yeah.
You're spot on. You're building that habitat, right?
Yeah.
That really promotes all these beneficial arthropods that you want to see in your field, like the no-till, right? Like you mentioned, you're not going out there plowing up the field. You've got a nice, stable microenvironment with lots of residue on top. That's really, really good for, again, our soil arthropods, like those carabid beetles that are some of your favorite, those ground beetles, as well as some of the springtails that are really active in making that residue disappear from the soil surface. So that no-till really, allows for that stable environment. And then, as you say, adding that cover crops on top, that's just that extra layer of complexity that can be really positive in, again, just kind of creating that habitat, having more crop residue on the surface. As you mentioned, like not having that field kind of be bare, more or less. Even if you're having that residue on there, you're really like building this habitat bridge, more or less, in between seasons that really allows these beneficials to thrive. And especially when you're thinking about like predatory natural enemies, you really want them kind of active in your fields when those crops are at vulnerable stages, like the early season vegetative stages, right? Having that cover crop in there gives them, the natural enemies, that habitat, allowing them to kind of move in, do their job in a really efficient manner in the cash crop where you really are looking for some of those pest control benefits. So yeah, building that habitat is crucial, and I think, like you mentioned too, you're really feeding. You're not only feeding the soil, right, but you're feeding those other beneficial bugs that we're talking about today. And I think one way that cover crops and no-till is especially good at doing that is when we're thinking about, like, from a natural enemy or predator perspective, the pests that we want them to be eating are not around all the time, right? And so we want to keep those predators in the field so that when the pests are around, they're ready to go. And so having that, like, kind of no-till habitat and supporting what we think of in the kind of entomological world as alternative prey or non-pest prey, basically, allows those predators to feed on something that keeps them alive, keeps them healthy and happy in the field, so that they're around when those pests kind of can come into play, and they need to be basically targeted by these natural enemies. So having that alternative prey in the mix is a really important factor for keeping predators healthy and happy, and that's one thing that the cover crops and no-till certainly do.
Right. Well, in the cover crops, it gives refuge for your beneficial bugs too.
Yeah. They like complexity. That's kind of one thing that we know from a lot of ecological studies on some of these natural enemies is they really prefer and are best at doing what they need to do in complex habitats. And so that's exactly what you're giving them out there with your no-till, maintaining that crop residue, and then adding cover crops into the mix. Just stacking that complexity is really beneficial for the natural enemies.
I'd never thought about that alternative prey. I mean, that makes total sense. They're not just going to hang out eating nothing for like months, waiting for the next flight of pests to come in. So,
right, yep.
You learn something new every day. That's why I do this,
Yep.
just to learn from all of you. But Tom, one of the reasons why I want to chat with you, one, you're a great person, and two, you plant naked seed for your soybeans. You don't put any seed treatment on that, and not many people do that. And there are reasons why that we'll get into in a little bit. But I'm curious about kind of what prompted that shift, because you used to apply seed treatments in the past, and why you decided to take those off. And have you seen anything change as a result over the years?
Yeah, so I think this is probably my 5th season, I think, somewhere around there, that I haven't had treated seed. So, and I guess what triggered my thought on it years ago was I started having a lot of slug feeding. And somewhere along the line, I read something about ground beetles and all Dane's bugs and stuff like that.
Dane's bugs.
And the seed treatment had an effect on them. And it's like, well, that's all of a sudden I started seeing more slug activity. And looking back, you kind of think back in the timeline, it's like, okay, I started using seed treatments, and well, it probably takes a little time for that really to, and after a few years of it, it's like, there's something to this. And I thought, you know what, I'm just going to try it. So one year, I took one field, and I put untreated seed on it. And I just had seed in the bag, paper, 50-pound bag, poured them in the planter, and I thought, okay, I'm going to do a yield test. And those beans didn't yield any worse than anything other beans, or they did just as well, let's put it that way. So there was no yield difference between the treated beans and the untreated. And I thought to myself, well, why the hell am I treating my beans then? And it was just, and years ago, I look at it when I was young, and when I first started working with my dad when I was in my 20s, it's like, well, you get soybean seed. It was always in a paper bag. It was like you took it out of the, it was clean seed. You put it in the planter or the grain drill, and you mixed in your inoculant, and that was all you did.
Yeah. And
we were getting 70, 80 bushel beans then. And it's like, now all of a sudden we put all this treatment on them, and now we're struggling to get 60.
Yeah.
So I thought, well, I just didn't think it was necessary. And after learning that it has a negative effect on my predator bugs against the slugs, and slugs to me is my biggest pest.
Okay.
And I thought, you know what, so I quit doing it, and so I quit treating them, and I still inoculate them.
Yeah.
And my bean yields are just as good as they were before. So it's like, I know some guys say, well, they wouldn't get away with that planting early. Right. Well, generally, I'm not planting my beans real early like some people, because my soils aren't fit for it either. Yeah. that's something people have to consider too.
Right.
Is your land has to be fit to be ready to plant.
Right.
You know.
You're not pushing mid-April for your planting.
No,
dates.
no. I mean, I'll go at the end of April, but even then, sometimes that can be too early.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah.
Depends on your soil conditions. Well, and what the weather's going to do.
Yeah.
You know, a few years ago, I planted some beans, and it was right at the end of April. I think it was like the 25th, 6th, 7th, whatever, somewhere around there.
Mm-hmm.
Well, then it was really nice out. We had really nice stretch of weather and good conditions. Oh, okay, I'll go plant some beans. It was all ready to go. The week after that, it got cold and wet, and we had and you know, those beans didn't do so well.
Yeah.
But there again, they weren't treated either.
Yeah.
I don't know, but I don't know. And from what I've been learning lately, some of those seed treatments may not really do you any good anyhow sometimes. Yeah. I don't know, but I just feel for me, I don't need to spend the money on it.
Totally.
So
it's nice to like just listen to you kind of describe your thought process, right, and going through that, because like whether you mean to or not, you're really kind of describing integrated pest management, right, which is really kind of this idea that you can use a variety of different strategies to tackle pest problems in your field, and typically the chemical control aspect is something that you kind of turn to when the other maybe strategies that you've relied on have failed. So it's kind of a last resort, and so you're like, you know, you're scrutinizing your use of this insecticide, right? Is it really necessary for the situation that I'm in? And I think that's just a really great example of thinking in that integrated pest management framework, which, you know, as you mentioned too, like, you know, when you're in these no-till cropping systems, all of a sudden these slugs start to kind of these pesky mollusks become more of an issue, and they're not insects, and so the insecticides that we're using are not going to be effective in managing these slugs. So we have to again rely on, you know, more of the natural enemies, this biological control. So just listening to you talk about how you kind of thought through that problem was really interesting, and I think is just a good reminder of how to kind of use this integrated pest management framework for decision makings, especially when we're thinking about like the preventative pest management approach. And I want to just give a shout out to the John Tucher's lab at Penn State, who's done a lot of this initial work thinking about how seed treatments impact the natural enemies of slugs. I'm sure that's some of the work you probably came across out there from his group. So yeah, it's just a nice example of this way of thinking about pest management that I think you've exemplified really nicely.
So I'm curious, Tom, when you started taking off the seed treatment on your soybeans, did you see a change in slug pressure?
I think it took a little time. It wasn't like the first year, but
right.
But that makes sense. It takes a while for these predator populations to build back up.
So. Yeah, but now I think all the fields that are on that good rotation, I think the row crop rotation has a big point of part of it too, really. Mm-hmm. But I am seeing a lot less slug pressure. I would say that. Yeah. I mean the year that slugs introduced themselves to me. It was crazy. They always say slugs are in wet soils and that. Yeah. So it was 2012 on a hilltop. It was kind of light soil, 2012, how dry
super dry.
Yeah. And really light soil on a hilltop. And I had patches of beans that were gone.
Really?
And I'm like, well, what the hell's, I didn't know what was going on. So the agronomist looked at it. Well, we replanted some beans. We replanted them.
Oh, God.
Chewing them off again, and then the patches kept getting bigger.
Oh no!
And I started looking at it, and I see this like silver sheen on the soil during the day, and I'm like, and then I talked to someone else, and they said something, and they said, well, do you see that silver is the soil shiny? And I said, well, yeah. I said, well, that's slugs. Well, I was like, well, what the hell's that? And I didn't know what. So yeah, that was when I got introduced to slugs in the spring of 2012.
And the opposite conditions.
And that was the year. and that was the year.
To the rule.
Year it was so dry.
Yeah. Huh.
And I suppose they were, however they got there.
Yeah.
And then, because there was no moisture, well, anything that was green and growing, that's what they latched onto that. But the year before that, I had planted radishes into that field. And I think there's a correlation to radishes and slugs. It's because
Yeah.
they call it a garden slug for a reason. You got
Yeah, there is some anecdotal evidence, and even a little past that kind of implicates brassicas as being something that slugs can be attracted to.
So that's
something to think about when you're thinking of cover crops, right?
Right. So that's why I shied away from radishes.
Yeah.
Actually, I use sunflowers now as my deep tiller.
Nice.
Yeah.
They're pretty and they got nice roots.
That's true.
There we go.
I don't remember that one. Sunflowers, they're pretty. They got nice roots. What about this year? This year would have been the year for the slug. I know Dane was fielding calls left and right this spring about slugs everywhere. What was?
2024.
Yeah.
I did have some slug activity,
Yeah.
but yeah, from what I had heard, it was all over.
Yeah.
And I think it was because it was so wet.
Right.
And I did have some corn. Usually corn gets ahead of it,
Yeah.
but it was so wet, and I had some fields that just were not well drained, I guess you could say, in spots, and
Right.
the residue was probably a little heavier.
Mm-hmm.
And with all the heavy rain, I think it moved the residue. That's the thing I found with slugs. If you have like residue pockets or piles or something, that's where they sit. But if your residue is spread evenly across the field, it's not as big a problem.
Oh, interesting.
So
the rain moved it around.
right, and
piled
kind
it
of
up.
created like just little berms or whatever.
Yeah.
Well, that's just a perfect habitat for a slug. Corn's struggling in that, and they can't get ahead of it.
Yeah.
So the slugs are. But if you have a nice evenly distributed field as far as residue or whatever chaff, it's not as bad. I'd say it's you create it even across the whole field.
Yeah.
And I would bet too, just given the kind of longer term history of some of your use of these conservation practices, the incorporation of the wheat into rotation, these are all things that again are kind of building up these natural enemy communities over time, so that when you do have, say, a really bad like outbreak year, like many people experience in 2024, it's not that bad on your farm, because you've ultimately kind of created this system to where you can more or less like absorb that shock, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's a good anecdote again of that, your practices working in action.
Right.
So Dane, you mentioned that slugs are not an insect, which, yes, but also intuitively no.
Closely more related to octopi than the beetles.
Yeah, pesky mollusk, as you said. Can you dive a little bit more into the details of what's happening with these insecticide seed treatments and slugs, and how it's not affecting them and it's actually hurting some of our beneficials, and kind of that cycle as to why are then the slugs so dominant in some of these areas where maybe they've been more exposed to some of these seed treatments?
Yeah, we can dive into that a little bit. So when we're thinking about specifically with the slugs, right? So slugs are not insects, and they're going to be feeding on a soybean plant that's been treated with a neonicotinoid seed treatment. So they're actually not going to be impacted by that poison at all. They are going to instead, basically take that into their body. It's going to be in their tissues and their mucus, so that when a natural enemy comes around, like a ground beetle, and attacks a slug, well, in that case, it's going to eat that slug, get a mouthful of tissue or a mucus, and then that toxin actually goes into the ground beetle and has a negative effect, sometimes killing the ground beetle outright. More oftentimes, it kind of has what we think of as like a sublethal effect, so it doesn't actually kill it, but it makes it really bad at doing its job as a ground beetle, which is typically eating other bugs. And so it's actually kind of transfers up through the food chain in the case of the slug. So that's how those ground beetles can be impacted by some of these interactions between the slugs and the seed treatments. Other things that we kind of think about when we're thinking of non-target effects of these seed treatments is, again, the impact on some of these soil arthropods. So we touched on the predators with the ground beetles there. When we're thinking about decomposition, there's been some work out there that's actually shown how soils and plants that have had neonicotinoid seed treatments used actually slows down the ability of good bugs like the springtails and the millipedes that we've mentioned so far to actually break down that residue and return those nutrients to the soil. So, for example, one study out there showed that in plots that were treated with either a broadcast insecticide or a seed treatment, they saw a 10% slower decomposition rate when these insecticides were used compared to a field where there was no insecticide used. And again, this was tied back to direct reductions in the springtail and the millipede populations. So again, there's a non-target impact on these beneficial bugs coming from the use of some of these seed treatments and other insecticides generally that are, kind of in some ways working against us in terms of what we want to be seeing out of some of these conservation cropping systems. So yeah, I'd say those are some two examples specific to the predators and the decomposers that we're talking about.
So you mentioned something about residue breaking down. It just triggered my thought. Mm-hmm. One thing I always noticed, and other people have made the comment too, like if you have smart stack corn or triple stack, it's got all the traits in it.
The bells and whistles.
That corn doesn't seem to break down as fast.
Interesting.
And has that got something to do with, because does that have a negative effect on the ground beetles and your decomposer bugs?
Yeah, that's interesting. Not that I'm aware of. I have not heard anything specifically, or I'm not aware of any research that's looked at like the traits that are included in some of these varietals. But we know certainly the seed treatments that do accompany some of those kind of higher level genetics, for lack of a better term, as we just described, will have some type of an impact. But that's a good question. I'm not sure.
Yeah, that was something that I don't plant any smart stack corn anymore. It's because I don't really have any corn on corn, so I have no reason to do that. But I know there was times that I did use some, and it did seem like those stalks took a little bit more to break down. But other farmers have made the comment about that too. It's like, well, they're using smart stack corn, and some of them are actually even having to go back to using insecticide because it's the rootworm is so bad.
Right.
It's like, well, that can't be any good for your beneficial bugs at all.
Yeah, some of the kind of preventative plant or broadcast, calendar-based sprays, however you want to put it. Those are certainly, things that similar to the seed treatments have unintended consequences, right?
Yeah. And then I will say that there are some cases where, it does pay to put some sort of seed treatment on. And Tom, you're not doing this because you're not planting that early, but Sean Conley, the soybean specialist at the university, has shown that if you're planting early or pushing that kind of mid-April dates, Dane, correct me if I'm wrong here, but the fungicide treatment is kind of important for maintaining that seed. Otherwise, that you're going to see it's going to pay for itself in that way. Yeah. Insecticide, not as much, but
yeah, I think you're spot on there. I think there's a lot more strong evidence out there showing that there's a ROI on using these fungicidal seed treatments, especially given certain scenarios, as Will mentioned, the early planting being one of them. There are definitely specific kind of use case scenarios where it really does make a lot of sense to have a seed treatment, an insecticidal seed treatment on your seed. Like, for example, if you're going to be planting into a CRP or pasture land, those are situations that tend to have populations of some of these soil-dwelling pests that build up over time, like wireworm and white grub, where you're gonna want your seed protected if you're going to be planting into those scenarios. Other things that we might be thinking about would be like if you're going to be double cropping soybean, following wheat, for example. Those are again specific, really targeted scenarios where you would want to have this kind of preventative pest management approach, and that would still fit in kind of with an integrated pest management framework as well. If you have problems with things like wireworm or seed corn maggot, if you know that these pests are in your field, then having a seed treatment is a really good idea to protect your investments there. I think what we're kind of discussing here is like getting away from the kind of insurance-based mindset, the preventative pest management approach, where you don't really know if you've got the pest that this seed treatment is supposed to be targeting. So certainly useful scenarios where you do want to have the seed treatment, but it's not. It's probably not the way that we're kind of using them right now.
One thing I think we'll wrap up with, Tom, is talked about planting naked seed, neonics, seed treatments, etc. What does the future look like for you and your bug populations? What are you excited with your favorite bugs, the millipedes and all those? What are you looking forward to doing out there to kind of continue to support these good bug populations?
Well, I'll just keep on the path I'm on,
Yeah.
I guess. One thing I thought about a little bit too is that the last few years, so I got a bunch of grass waterways that run through my valley, and they're shallow, so you can mow them.
Yeah.
Years ago, I used to mow them so they were nice and trimmed up like your lawn around your house, you know. The last few years, I quit doing that. I thought, you got to have a refuge for a lot of that stuff because there's a lot of clover in there, and there's a lot of bees go in there and stuff like that. So I'll mow around the edge of it, the perimeter of it, where it butts up against the fields, so I don't get the growth into the field, the grass and whatever. But I keep the center of it, and I don't mow that off until early fall or whenever, and just it gets mowed once and that's it. So I kind of, in other areas around the farm, I'm kind of, where I used to mow a lot and keep things trimmed up, I'm kind of trying to leave more of a refuge for things.
Oh, nice.
Wow, that's awesome.
And I see more of the milkweed. Milkweed's a big thing for the butterflies.
Your butterflies.
My number
for
one
your
bug.
I'm trying to save your butterflies.
Thank you, Tom.
So I'm kind of paying attention to some of that. Unless it's some noxious weeds, ragweed or something, if that stuff's growing, you mow that off. But if it's just, I get a lot of clover and back behind the buildings, I got hairy vetch growing up in the hills. Something my dad planted years ago for erosion control on the steep hills and stuff. Parts of the old pasture and whatever. And you let that stuff grow and bloom, and, you don't need to mow it off. So...
Yeah, that's really awesome to kind of see your thinking, and what you're doing in terms of habitat manipulation or lack thereof and outside of the farm field, because you're whether you're intended to or not, you're doing a lot of these really great practices, for boosting beneficial insect populations. You're thinking in this kind of integrated pest management mindset, and really kind of like the next level to go to is kind of what you just described. Thinking about these non-field habitats. A lot of these grass waterways are really excellent, refuges, as you mentioned, for things like your ground beetles. So paying attention to what you're doing or not doing to those areas is really like the next step that you're already taking in making sure that your farm is a hospitable place for these good bugs that are helping keep the bad bugs in check. So it's really, really fun to hear you kind of talk about your operation like that.
Excellent. Dane, finish this off with some resources that we should look at. If you got any on the top of your mind.
Definitely. Well, a big one, given that seed treatments have come up a lot in this discussion today, is a great publication from UW Extension called What's on Your Seed. A lot of times folks don't know what is on their seed, for lack of a better term. So this publication takes you through all sorts of seed treatments for corn, soybean, and wheat, I believe. Breaks them down into number of active ingredients, specifically what those active ingredients are, and whether they're a fungicide, insecticide, a nematicide, or along those lines. So really great resource for folks who might start thinking about a little bit more. What exactly am I doing with these seed treatments? That's an excellent resource out there. In terms of other things that Extension is doing, we're going to be doing some on-farm research here with the Dane Demo Farms, which Tom is a part of here, starting to just tease apart what type of practices are helpful in terms of boosting some of these beneficial ground beetle natural enemies. So specifically going to be looking at some natural enemy monitoring in the different cover crop termination timing treatments that the demo farms have set up. So we'll get a little bit more of a sense of how some of the management decisions within the conservation cropping systems can be, how those impact the number of good bugs that we're going to be seeing out there. So we'll be conducting some of that research in the spring and summer, and hopefully can pull together a nice resource for everyone once we have those data come in. So some things to stay on the lookout for.
Yeah, stay tuned. Well, Tom and Dane, thanks for coming on today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for bugging out.
Thanks for listening. This has been Field Notes from UW-Madison Extension. My name is Will Fullwider, Regional Crops Educator for Dane and Dodge Counties. A big thank you to Joe Ryan for creating our theme music, and to Abby Wilkie-Maki for our logo. If you have any questions about anything you've heard today or about your farming practices in general, reach out to the Extension agriculture educators serving your region. What's your favorite, Dane?
My favorite? Well, Tom chose 3, so I'm going to go with 3 too now.
Oh my gosh. I got to think.
Now that we're talking bugs, so I really like wasps. And I guess, you can think of wasps, they're a pretty big group. The ones that we're familiar with are maybe less desirable. They're the ones that are, building the nest up in your eaves and kind of annoying you and stinging you. But they're actually really, critical predators in the ecosystem as well, feeding on a lot of the potential pests that we might have in our field. Another very exciting bug that I want to throw out there as another favorite is are the parasitoid wasps. So these are wasps, but they're very, very small. They're not like the kind of big, showy, black and yellow stinging wasps that most of us are familiar with. The parasitoid wasps are, again, really beneficial natural enemies that are actually going out and finding caterpillars or other things that are chewing on our plants. They'll actually go up to it and they'll lay an egg either on or inside of it, inside the caterpillar, and then that egg hatches and it basically starts to eat the caterpillar from the inside out. And then eventually, emerges from it in a very kind of sci-fi, alien-esque manner. So those are they're ones we want on our side for sure. So wasps, parasitoid wasps, and some of our kind of classic stinging wasps. And then I'll throw a third one out there, and that'll be the springtails or the colembula, which are really kind of small, soil-dwelling arthropods, similar in function to the millipedes that Tom described in terms of chewing on residue, breaking down organic matter, and really increasing the potential for microbes to cycle those nutrients effectively and return them back to the soil where plants can use them. Springtails and wasps.
Well, Dane, I was going to say that once, so now I have to think, because I was trying to win brownie points over here. Butterflies, my favorite, because they're very beautiful. So, there we go.